December 24, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. Just after midnight, flames rose into the winter sky from a modest two-story home along Route 16. By dawn, the house would be reduced to ash. 5 children would be declared dead. And yet, in the debris of that Christmas Eve fire, not a single confirmed human remain would ever be found. The house belonged to George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a comfortable life in the Appalachian Hills. They were known in town as hardworking and self-sufficient. George operated a trucking business. Jenny managed the home. Together they were raising 10 children. On that particular night, 9 were home. It had been an ordinary Christmas Eve. The older boys had been working. The younger children were excited, asking to stay up a little later to play with new toys. Around 10 p.m., George and Jenny went to bed, leaving 5 of the children, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, still awake upstairs. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny answered, "Sue." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, asking for a name she didn't recognize. She heard laughter and glasses clinking in the background. It sounded like a party. She told the caller they had the wrong number. When she hung up, she noticed the lights were still on downstairs and the doors unlocked. She turned them off and locked up, then returned to bed. Half an hour later, she was awakened again, this time by smoke. The fire was already spreading fast, starting near the back of the house. George rushed to wake the children. He and 2 of their sons managed to escape through a window. Jenny followed, but the 5 youngest children remained upstairs. George tried to reach them. He attempted to re-enter through the front door, but flames blocked the way. He ran to the side of the house, intending to climb to the second-floor window using a ladder that was always kept against the home. The ladder was gone. He then tried to move one of his coal trucks beneath the window so he could climb onto it. Neither truck would start. Both had been functioning the day before. By the time firefighters arrived, hours later, due to limited rural resources and a delayed phone tree system, the house had collapsed into itself. The official conclusion was swift. The 5 children had perished in the fire. The intense heat, authorities said, had completely cremated their bodies. But George Sodder refused to accept that explanation. He searched the site himself. Days later, he found small household items still intact. A partially melted clock, kitchen appliances, metal bed springs. If these objects had survived, how could 5 bodies be reduced entirely to ash? A local crematorium operator later told the family that even at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, bones typically leave recognizable fragments. The Sodders pressed for answers. A coroner's inquest ruled the cause as accidental, faulty wiring. Yet George insisted the house had been recently rewired and inspected. Then came the strange details. A witness later claimed to have seen a man near the Sodder home the night of the fire carrying a block and tackle, a device used for climbing or moving heavy objects. Another neighbor reported seeing the missing ladder propped against a nearby embankment days after the fire. One of George's sons discovered that the home's phone line had not burned through. It had been cut. A bus driver passing through Fayetteville that night told authorities he saw people throwing what appeared to be balls of fire at the house. Months later, one of the children's cousins found a small, hard rubber object in the yard. George believed it resembled a napalm, a pineapple bomb used in wartime. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. As suspicions deepened, so did George's paranoia. Years earlier, he had openly criticized Benito Mussolini and the fascist government in Italy. Some members of the local Italian community had not appreciated his comments. There had been threats. One man had warned him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Was the fire retaliation? In the weeks following the blaze, reports began surfacing from outside West Virginia. A woman in Charleston claimed to have seen the children in a car with 2 men the morning after the fire. A tourist stop owner in South Carolina said she served breakfast to 5 children matching their descriptions, accompanied by 2 adults of Italian descent. A woman in Florida reported seeing children who looked like the Sodders staying at a motel. None of these leads were ever confirmed. George and Jenny refused to move on. They erected a large billboard along Route 16 displaying the faces of their missing children and offering a reward for information. It stood for decades. Drivers passing through Fayetteville could not ignore it. 5 faces staring outward. 5 names. 5 unanswered questions. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny received a photograph in the mail. It depicted a young man in his 20s. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, eel boys." And then 132 or 35. The handwriting was unfamiliar. There was no return address. The family hired a private investigator. He traveled to Kentucky to follow a lead tied to the photo. He was never heard from again. Authorities maintained their original conclusion: tragic accident. Children lost in a house fire. No evidence of kidnapping. No conspiracy. Yet key questions remained unresolved. Why was there no physical evidence of remains? Why were the trucks disabled? Who cut the phone line? And who sent the photograph decades later? George Sodder died in 1969, still believing his children had survived. Jenny passed away years later. The billboard eventually came down. Today, the Sodder Children mystery remains one of America's most haunting, unresolved cases. Official records list 5 deaths. But for many who have examined the details, the case file feels incomplete. A Christmas Eve fire, a missing ladder, a cut phone line, sightings across state lines, and 5 children who may have vanished into the dark, leaving behind nothing but ash and doubt. Nearly 80 years later, the question still lingers in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Did 5 children perish in a fire, or were they taken into the night while the world believed they had burned? In the years that followed, the ashes of the Sodder home cooled, but suspicion did not. George Sodder began conducting his own quiet investigation. He walked the property repeatedly, studying the terrain as if expecting the ground to reveal something authorities had overlooked. He spoke to neighbors again and again, comparing their recollections. Small inconsistencies began to stand out. One neighbor admitted that on the morning after the fire, before daylight had fully broken, he saw a man removing what appeared to be a ladder from the Sodder property. Another local recalled seeing a strange vehicle parked along the road in the hours before the flames were discovered. These accounts had not been thoroughly documented in the initial reports. The fire department's response time became another troubling detail. In rural West Virginia in 1945, the system relied on a phone tree. One volunteer would call the next. But that night, the chain faltered. The fire chief later explained that he could not drive the engine himself because he did not know how to operate it properly. By the time assistance arrived, the structure had already collapsed. When investigators sifted through the rubble, they claimed to have found fragments of human vertebrae. Fawn fragment. However, months later, it was quietly revealed that these bone fragments had likely come from a cemetery soil used to fill the Sodder family's garden months earlier. The site had not been secured properly. The chain of custody for evidence was loose, almost casual. George fixated on the wiring explanation. He brought in an independent electrician to review what remained of the house's electrical system. The electrician concluded that a wiring fault was unlikely to have caused such a rapid and explosive fire. Furthermore, several lights in the home had reportedly remained on during the blaze. If the wiring had shorted, power would likely have failed. Then there were the trucks. Both coal trucks, which had functioned the previous day, failed to start during the emergency. A mechanic later examined them and found no clear mechanical failure. George believed they had been tampered with. The theory forming in his mind was simple but chilling. The fire was not an accident. It was a distraction. If someone had entered the home that night, perhaps using the missing ladder, they could have removed the 5 children before the fire consumed the structure. The blaze, once set, would erase evidence and create the appearance of tragedy, but motive remained unclear. George's outspoken criticism of fascism had made him unpopular with certain members of the local Italian community. In the years before the fire, a life insurance salesman had reportedly warned him that his house would burn and his children would be destroyed as punishment for his views. Whoa. The salesman later served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. It was an uncomfortable detail. Not proof, but enough to deepen distrust. As the years passed, sightings continued to surface. A priest reportedly claimed that he had seen the children in Italy. A letter allegedly postmarked from Central Europe was mentioned, though never verified publicly. None of these leads produced tangible results. No confirmed photographs beyond the single image received in 1968. No fingerprints. No official reopenings of the case. The photograph itself remained one of the most debated pieces of evidence. The young man's features bore a resemblance to Louis Sodder, particularly the eyes and jawline. Forensic analysis decades later was inconclusive. The writing on the back, cryptic and partially garbled, offered no direct trace. By the 1970s, public interest in the case had faded. The billboard still stood along the highway, weathered but visible. The reward offer remained posted. Drivers who passed through Fayetteville would sometimes stop, read the names, and continue on, carrying the story with them. Law enforcement agencies never officially classified the case as a kidnapping. There was no confession, no verified witness placing the children elsewhere beyond speculation. The official record held steady, 5 victims of a tragic Christmas fire. Yet the absence of remains continued to trouble independent researchers. Modern fire experts have suggested that while intense fires can destroy much, complete cremation without controlled conditions is rare. The Sodder house burned for a limited time before collapsing. Ash was not sifted using methods that would meet today's forensic standards. The unanswered details accumulate quietly, like dust in an archive box. A cut phone line, a ladder moved from its usual place, 2 disabled trucks, multiple out-of-state sightings, a photograph decades later. Each element alone may be explainable. Together they form a pattern that resists simple closure. Today, the property where the Sodder house once stood is unremarkable. The landscape has changed. Trees have grown. The road remains. You remain. Few physical traces of the event survive, but the case file endures in records and archived interviews, in the memories passed down through generations in Fayetteville. The Sodder Children mystery remains officially closed, yet psychologically unresolved. It sits in a space between documented tragedy and possible abduction, between accident and intent. And as long as those 5 names remain without confirmed remains, without definitive proof, the question persists quietly beneath the surface of history. What truly happened in the early hours of December 25, 1945? The fire burned for only a few hours. The uncertainty has lasted a lifetime. As decades passed, the mystery shifted from an active search to a lingering question embedded in American true crime history. What began as a local tragedy in rural West Virginia gradually became a case studied by independent researchers, journalists, and later, internet investigators who revisited the inconsistencies with modern eyes. One of the most debated aspects remains the science of the fire itself. In 1945, forensic fire investigation was far less advanced than it is today. There was no standardized national protocol for analyzing burn patterns, no sophisticated laboratory testing for accelerants. The conclusion of accidental electrical fire rested largely on assumption rather than detailed reconstruction. The house had burned intensely, yes, but it had also collapsed quickly, potentially smothering parts of the blaze beneath debris. Modern fire experts who have informally reviewed the case often point to one central issue. Complete destruction of 5 bodies without identifiable bone fragments would be highly unusual in an uncontrolled residential fire. Even in crematoriums, bones are mechanically processed after burning. They do not simply vanish, yet skeptics of the kidnapping theory counter with practical explanations. The Sodder home was constructed with timber framing and had coal stored on the property. It is possible that pockets of intense heat formed, accelerating combustion beyond what witnesses perceived. The search of the debris was not conducted with today's forensic rigor. Remains, if present, could have been missed or inadvertently discarded. The question then becomes not what is possible, but what is probable. The alleged sightings add another layer of ambiguity. Human memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through media coverage and reward notices. After the billboard went up, faces of the missing children became widely recognized. It is plausible that well-meaning individuals misidentified strangers as the Sodder Children. None of the sightings produced documentation strong enough to compel federal intervention. The photograph mailed in 1968 remains one of the most tantalizing elements. Handwriting analysis did not conclusively link it to anyone known to the family. Postal tracing methods at the time were limited. Without a return address, the envelope led nowhere. Some investigators suggest it may have been a cruel hoax exploiting the family's grief. Others argue that the timing, more than 20 years after the fire, suggests long-term secrecy if it was authentic. There is also the cultural context of 1945 to consider. World War II had just ended. Immigration networks between the United States and Europe were complex. Organized crime structures existed in various forms, though no direct evidence ever connected the Sodder case to criminal syndicates. Still, the idea that children could be removed and relocated within ethnic communities was not entirely implausible in that era. But plausibility is not proof. Law enforcement agencies never produced documentation showing ransom demands, confirmed suspects, or verified travel records involving the children. No one ever stepped forward with credible inside knowledge. No deathbed confession emerged. The case exists in a vacuum of partial clues without convergence. George Sodder's certainty that his children survived shaped much of the narrative. His refusal to accept the official explanation kept the case alive publicly. Some observers believe his conviction may have influenced how evidence was interpreted within the family. Grief can alter perception. Hope can solidify into belief. Yet Jenny Sodder reportedly continued to set 5 extra place settings at Christmas dinner for years after the fire. That detail does not prove abduction, but it reflects the psychological weight of uncertainty, a grief suspended without finality. As the original witnesses aged and passed away, so did opportunities for clarification. Memories faded. Records were misplaced. The physical site changed. What remains now are archived interviews, newspaper clippings, and the persistent absence of definitive physical evidence. In recent years, renewed interest has surfaced periodically. Amateur genealogists have attempted to trace the mysterious code written on the back of the photograph. Online communities debate the logistics of the fire. Podcasts and documentaries revisit the timeline, reconstructing the night minute by minute. Still, the official record remains unchanged. 5 children, presumed dead, cause, house fire, and yet the absence of remains continues to resist quiet acceptance. The Sodder Children mystery does not end with a courtroom verdict or a recovered body. It ends, or perhaps pauses, in ambiguity, a rural road in Fayetteville, a house that no longer stands, a billboard that once demanded answers, and 5 names that remain suspended between history and disappearance. Some mysteries endure not because of dramatic revelations, but because of small, unresolved details that refuse to align. In this case, those details have lingered for more than 80 years. On Christmas Eve 1945, a fire burned through a family home. Whether it also erased the truth is something no official report has ever fully resolved. Time has a way of softening events, turning once urgent investigations into quiet historical footnotes. But in Fayetteville, the Sodder case never fully settled into the past. It remained present, not loudly, not officially reopened, but as something unfinished. In the 1980s and 1990s, as forensic science advanced, renewed discussions surfaced about what might have been done differently. Investigators today would secure the perimeter immediately. Debris would be sifted systematically. Soil samples would be cataloged. Bone fragments, even the smallest, would undergo laboratory testing. Dental records would be requested. DNA comparison would be possible. None of those tools were available in rural West Virginia in 1945. The site of the Sodder home had been disturbed repeatedly after the fire. George himself bulldozed dirt over the area months later, creating a memorial garden. If physical evidence remained in the soil, it may have been permanently buried or contaminated. By the time modern forensic curiosity emerged, the opportunity for conclusive testing had long passed. Some researchers have revisited the theory of intentional arson tied to personal retaliation. George Sodder's vocal criticism of fascism was documented. He had arguments with men in town. There were warnings. However, no surviving record establishes a direct plan or organized effort to harm the family. No coordinated group was identified. Motive remains circumstantial. Other analysts propose a simpler, though still disturbing possibility. A targeted act by a small number of individuals unrelated to politics, perhaps driven by personal grievance or criminal opportunity. The missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and the cut phone lines suggest preparation. But preparation does not automatically confirm kidnapping. It could also indicate deliberate arson intended to trap occupants inside. If that were the case, the fire itself would have been the primary instrument of harm, not a diversion, but the central act. Yet that interpretation circles back to the same problem. No confirmed remains. The absence is the axis upon which the entire mystery turns. There are documented cases in which remains were initially overlooked in large structural fires, only to be discovered years later during excavation. But in this case, no such discovery occurred. No construction project uncovered bone fragments. No accidental find emerged decades afterward. It is possible that children did perish in the fire and that early searches were simply inadequate. It is possible they were removed before or during the blaze. It is possible that some combination of panic, poor investigation, and grief created a narrative that drifted further from clarity with each passing year. What remains consistent is the emotional trajectory of the Sodder family. George died convinced that at least some of his children survived. Jenny reportedly wore black for the rest of her life. The billboard, with its aging photographs and reward offer, became both a public appeal and a private declaration. It said, without stating it directly, that the case was not closed. Eventually, the billboard came down. Weather and time wore it away. New generations grew up in Fayetteville knowing the story only through retelling. Today, the Sodder Children mystery occupies a particular space in American criminal history. It is not classified as an official kidnapping case. It is not formally listed among solved fire fatalities with verified remains. It exists in the gap between categories. 5 children, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, declared dead on December 25, 1945. Never conclusively identified among the ruins. The final official paperwork closed the file decades ago, but the unanswered details remain cataloged in archived statements and preserved interviews. Scholars of unresolved cases often cite the Sodder mystery as an example of how early investigative limitations can shape public perception for generations. There is no dramatic ending to this case, no courtroom confession, no recovered evidence that rewrites the narrative. There is only the record of what was found and what was not. On a cold Christmas night in West Virginia, a house burned to the ground. In the space where 5 children should have been accounted for, there remains only uncertainty. And sometimes in investigative history, uncertainty is the only conclusion that survives. In the absence of resolution, a case like this does not end. It transforms. It moves from active investigation into analysis, from analysis into theory, from theory into legacy. By the early 2000s, researchers began revisiting the Sodder file with a more structured approach. Newspaper archives were digitized. Old witness statements were compared side by side. Timelines were reconstructed with greater precision. When placed under closer scrutiny, the night of December 24, 1945 reveals a sequence of events that remains unsettling not because of dramatic anomalies, but because of small, layered irregularities. At approximately 10 p.m., the household was stable. At 12:30 a.m., a strange phone call interrupted the quiet. By 1 a.m., smoke was spreading. Within a short window of time, access to the house had become impossible. The ladder was gone. The trucks were inoperable. The phone line was disabled. Each element reduces the family's ability to respond. Boulody to respond. Critics of the abduction theory argue that chaos during a fire can distort perception. In darkness and panic, it is possible to overlook details. A ladder might have been moved earlier and forgotten. Trucks might have stalled due to cold weather. Phone lines can fail during structural collapse. Individually, none of these factors conclusively prove interference. But when viewed together, they raise a broader question. Coincidence or coordination? Another element often overlooked is the speed of official closure. The coroner's jury ruled accidental fire relatively quickly. In rural communities at the time, limited resources and social familiarity between officials could accelerate conclusions. There was no prolonged forensic review. No outside agency took control. The matter was treated as a tragic household fire. The Sodders' insistence on further inquiry placed them in a delicate position. Challenging official conclusions in a small town could create tension. Over time, some community members reportedly viewed George's persistence as refusal to accept grief rather than legitimate suspicion. Social pressure may have quietly discouraged deeper local investigation. As years passed, theories expanded beyond the immediate environment. One hypothesis suggests that if the children were removed, the operation may have been facilitated by individuals familiar with the family's routines, or someone who knew where the ladder was kept, someone aware of the layout of the house, someone who understood the terrain and escape routes in the area. Another line of speculation examines interstate movement. In 1945, identification systems were less centralized. Travel between states required little documentation. If children were transported quickly and assimilated into another community, especially within extended immigrant networks, tracing them would have been extraordinarily difficult without a direct witness or confession. However, no concrete record supports that such a relocation occurred. The 1968 photograph remains the single piece of physical evidence suggesting survival beyond 1945. Some analysts have studied the image composition, clothing style, background architecture, the apparent age progression. The young man appears to be in his 20s, consistent with Louise Sodder's age had he survived. Yet resemblance alone cannot establish identity. No confirmed forensic comparison was possible at the time. The cryptic message on the back, partially legible, partially coded, has generated multiple interpretations. Some suggest the alphanumeric sequence could reference a military code, an inmate number, or a foreign registry. None of these interpretations have been verified. Without additional context, the writing remains an isolated artifact. There is also the psychological dimension. When a body is not recovered, the grieving process changes. Closure is interrupted. The mind searches for alternatives. This phenomenon has been documented in missing persons cases across decades. Families often report a persistent sense that something remains unfinished. That instinct, while deeply human, does not confirm survival. But it does explain why the Sodders could not accept the official explanation without physical proof. Modern investigators reviewing the case tend to divide into two camps. The first group concludes that the children most likely perished in the fire, and that early investigative shortcomings created an enduring illusion of mystery. According to this view, the absence of remains is attributable to incomplete search methods, structural collapse, and contamination of the site. The additional irregularities, ladder, truck's phone line, are interpreted as circumstantial and possibly exaggerated over time. The second group argues that the convergence of anomalies is statistically unlikely to be random. They emphasize the cut phone line, eyewitness accounts of individuals near the property, and reports of sightings shortly after the fire. From this perspective, the fire functioned as cover rather than cause. Both positions acknowledge a critical limitation: the passage of time. Witnesses are no longer available for re-interview. Physical evidence has deteriorated or disappeared. Memories recorded decades later are shaped by reflection and retelling. Without new material evidence, the case remains static. In recent years, occasional proposals have surfaced suggesting excavation of the original site using modern ground-penetrating radar. However, because the property was significantly altered and soil moved, the likelihood of discovering intact remains is low. Even if fragments were found, degradation over 80 years would complicate identification. What persists is not new evidence, but the endurance of unanswered detail. The Sodder Children mystery illustrates how investigative gaps can extend uncertainty across generations. It demonstrates how early assumptions, once recorded in official documents, become institutionalized. It reveals how grief and suspicion can coexist without resolution. On Christmas Eve 1945, 5 children were present in a house that burned. After the fire, those 5 children were never physically accounted for. That is the factual core. Everything beyond that, retaliation, kidnapping, mistaken identity, investigative failure, exists in layers built around that absence. The billboard that once stood along Route 16 has long since been removed. The reward offer expired. The family members who fought for answers are gone. What remains is a documented event with an incomplete ending. There are cases where time uncovers buried truth through accidental discovery or confession. There are others where time seals the uncertainty permanently. The Sodder case appears to belong to the latter category. No definitive proof of death. No verified evidence of survival. Just a winter night in West Virginia, a fire that burned too quickly, and 5 names that were never conclusively laid to rest. In the archive of American Unsolved cases, the Sodder Children mystery remains not because of spectacle, but because of what was missing when the flames died down. And sometimes in investigative history, what is missing speaks louder than what was found. As the story continued to circulate through books, documentaries, and late-night radio discussions, the Sodder case gradually shifted from a local tragedy to a national unresolved mystery. Yet, despite renewed attention, no new primary evidence ever surfaced. The case remained anchored to the same core facts recorded in 1945. When analysts reconstruct the timeline with strict discipline, the window of uncertainty becomes remarkably narrow. Jenny Sodder received the unusual phone call at approximately 12:30 a.m. She reported laughter in the background and unfamiliar voices. The caller asked for someone who did not live there. The detail is often interpreted as suspicious, possibly a distraction to confirm that the household was occupied. However, misdialed calls were not uncommon, especially during holidays. Party noise in the background could indicate nothing more than coincidence. Roughly 30 minutes later, smoke was detected. If the fire was set deliberately, whoever initiated it would have required access to the property. The missing ladder becomes relevant here. According to George, the ladder was typically stored against the house. After the fire began, it was not there. Later, it was reportedly found down an embankment. Whether it had been moved before or during the fire remains unclear. The phone line is another critical element. Evidence later suggested it had been cut rather than burned through. A cut line indicates pre-fire tampering. Yet documentation of that discovery is limited, and chain of custody standards were not rigorous at the time. It is possible that interpretation evolved after the fact. The truck's failure to start also sits in a gray area. December temperatures in West Virginia can affect engines, especially older coal trucks. Mechanical inspection after the fire did not definitively prove sabotage, but neither did it conclusively rule it out. In criminal investigation, patterns matter. If one anomaly exists, it may be coincidence. If multiple anomalies cluster around a single event, probability begins to shift. The Sodder case contains several irregularities, but each one lacks definitive verification. Another dimension worth examining is the behavior of the fire itself. Witnesses describe the blaze as spreading rapidly. The house was constructed largely of wood, and Christmas decorations may have contributed to fuel load. Some researchers have suggested that if an accelerant or incendiary device had been used, burn patterns would have reflected abnormal intensity in specific areas. Unfortunately, no preserved forensic diagrams from the original scene exist to evaluate that possibility. There was mention of a small object found in the yard months later, described as resembling a wartime incendiary device. George believed it could have been a pineapple bomb. Without laboratory testing or official documentation, this object remains anecdotal evidence. The case also highlights a structural limitation common to mid-20th century rural investigations: jurisdictional boundaries. No federal agency formally assumed control. Interstate sightings, even if credible, were handled locally and often not coordinated across state lines. Today, missing children cases activate national alert systems and database entries. In 1945, such infrastructure did not exist. If the children had been transported across state borders, tracing them would have depended entirely on manual communication between departments. Over time, as public fascination grew, secondary narratives developed. Some writers proposed organized crime involvement. Others suggested international relocation. A few speculated about identity changes and assimilation into distant communities. Yet none of these theories are supported by documentary evidence beyond anecdote. What remains strongest is the emotional testimony of the parents. George's certainty did not waver. He reportedly studied the faces of young men he encountered in other states, comparing bone structure and expressions. Jenny preserved the children's rooms for years. Their refusal to declare emotional closure sustained public attention long after officials had closed the file. There is a delicate balance in cases like this between honoring parental instinct and maintaining evidentiary discipline. Grief can sharpen suspicion. It can also amplify coincidences. The Sodder case sits precisely at that intersection. If the children died in the fire, then the tragedy is compounded by investigative shortcomings that left their parents without proof. If they survived and were taken, then the tragedy expands into a coordinated crime that was never uncovered. Both scenarios carry profound weight. As historians examine the broader pattern of unsolved American mysteries from the early 20th century, the Sodder case consistently appears in discussions of investigative gaps. It serves as a reference point for how technological limitations, rural infrastructure, and rapid official conclusions can create long-term ambiguity. There have been periodic calls for formal reopening of the case, but without new material evidence, agencies are limited in what they can pursue. DNA databases require reference samples and comparative material. No verified remains exist for testing. The photograph from 1968 has never been conclusively linked to a living or deceased individual through modern forensic methods. And so the case remains suspended. A house that burned in the early hours of Christmas Day. 5 children whose bodies were never conclusively recovered. A family that never accepted the finality of official paperwork. In many unsolved cases, speculation eventually fades as memory weakens. The Sodder mystery endures because it contains just enough uncertainty to resist resolution, yet not enough evidence to tip definitively in either direction. The flames that night lasted only hours. The doubt has lasted generations. Whether the truth was lost in the fire itself or in the limitations of the investigation that followed is something history has not answered. And until new evidence emerges, if it ever does, the Sodder Children mystery remains a case defined not by what is known, but by what is known, but by what cannot be conclusively. Long after the physical evidence disappeared, the Sodder case continued to evolve in the realm of analysis. When historians and investigative writers revisit the file, they often begin not with the fire itself, but with the context surrounding the family in the months and years before December 1945. George Sodder was not an isolated man. He was active in business, outspoken in opinion, and known within the local Italian community. He had publicly criticized Benito Mussolini during a time when loyalty to Italy's political identity still carried emotional weight for some immigrants. While there is no verified document tying those disagreements directly to violence, multiple accounts describe heated exchanges and at least one explicit warning that his house could be destroyed. The significance of that warning depends entirely on interpretation. In small towns, arguments can be dramatic without leading to action. Words spoken in anger do not always translate into coordinated harm. Yet when tragedy later mirrors a prior threat, even loosely, suspicion gains permanence. Investigators who favor the retaliation theory point to the convergence of motive and irregularity, a man with known political disputes, a warning referencing fire, a fire that occurs under unusual circumstances, missing tools, disabled vehicles, a cut, phone line, These elements aligned create a narrative that feels structured, but narrative cohesion is not equivalent to proof. There is also the structural question of opportunity. If the children were removed before or during the fire, the perpetrators would have needed access to the upper floor without alerting the rest of the household. The Sodder home was not described as isolated beyond visibility. Neighbors were within driving distance. A vehicle parked near the property may have been noticed. However, nighttime conditions and the rural setting could have provided cover. Witnesses later claimed to have seen unfamiliar individuals in the area days prior to the fire. A man allegedly approached the home offering to perform electrical work and commented that the fuse boxes were dangerous. Another reportedly warned George about potential consequences for his political views. Each of these encounters, when viewed retrospectively, appears ominous. Yet at the time, they were not formally documented as threats. The timeline remains critical. If the phone call at 12:30 a.m. was indeed a deliberate distraction, it may have served as confirmation that the family was asleep or present. Within 30 minutes, smoke was detected. That narrow window suggests either a rapidly spreading accidental fire or a fire set shortly after the call. Some researchers have attempted to analyze the plausibility of complete body destruction in the given time frame. Residential fires can reach high temperatures, especially when fueled by wood and coal. However, cremation facilities operate under sustained controlled heat for extended periods, followed by mechanical processing of bone fragments. The Sodder house fire burned intensely but not under controlled conditions. If remains existed, they would likely have been fragmented rather than entirely obliterated. Yet one must also consider the collapse of the structure. When a wooden house collapses inward, debris can concentrate heat downward. Ash and debris layers may conceal small bone fragments. In 1945, excavation techniques were basic. Ash was reportedly cleared quickly. The site was not treated as a crime scene in the modern sense. Evidence preservation protocols were minimal. This is perhaps the most grounded explanation, not a vast conspiracy, but a flawed investigation. There is no documented federal forensic team analysis, no preserved sample logs, no detailed burn pattern diagrams. The official conclusion may have been influenced by the assumption that children trapped upstairs in a rapidly spreading fire would not survive. Without visible remains, absence was equated with total destruction. Then there are the reported sightings. In Charleston, a woman claimed to see the children in a vehicle with two men shortly after the fire. In South Carolina, a tourist stop operator believed she served them breakfast. In Florida, a motel owner reported a similar encounter. None of these reports resulted in confirmed identification. None produced photographs or documents tying the children to those locations. Human memory, especially following widespread publicity, is susceptible to suggestion. The billboard displaying the children's faces stood for years along a major route. Reward money was offered. It is possible that well-intentioned individuals connected unrelated observations to the case. And yet, one cannot ignore that multiple sightings occurred within months of the fire before the story had fully matured into legend. The 1968 photograph complicates matters further. It arrived anonymously, showing a young man whose facial structure resembled Louis Sodder. On the back was a cryptic message. No confirmed sender, no postal trace that led to resolution. Some handwriting analysts believe the note did not appear childish or rushed. Others considered it inconclusive. If authentic, the photograph implies survival into adulthood. If fraudulent, it demonstrates the cruel reach of hoaxes targeting grieving families. George's decision to hire a private investigator after receiving the photograph suggests that he believed the lead credible. The investigator reportedly traveled to pursue information but never delivered conclusive findings. Whether his silence was due to lack of evidence or something more unusual remains unclear. As years turned into decades, the story moved beyond immediate investigation and into cultural memory. The case began appearing in books about unsolved mysteries. Television segments revisited the narrative, often emphasizing its most dramatic aspects: the missing ladder, the cut phone line, the pineapple bomb theory. With repetition, certain details gained weight through familiarity rather than verification. Serious researchers attempt to separate documented fact from embellished retelling. When stripped to essentials, the confirmed facts are limited. A fire occurred. 5 children were not seen escaping. No confirmed remains were identified. Several irregular circumstances were reported. A photograph was received decades later. Everything else sits on varying degrees of evidentiary stability. The emotional core of the case lies in the absence of closure. Without bodies, death remains administrative rather than physical. Death certificates can be issued, insurance claims can be processed, but for parents, certainty often requires physical proof. Jenny reportedly continued to hope. George reportedly maintained belief. Their persistence transformed the case from private tragedy into public question. Today, modern forensic science offers possibilities that did not exist in 1945. DNA extraction from minimal bone fragments is now possible. Ground-penetrating radar can detect anomalies in soil. Digital facial recognition could, in theory, compare the 1968 photograph to genealogical databases. However, each of these methods requires source material. And in this case, source material is either degraded, lost, or never properly preserved. The Sodder Children mystery persists because it lacks a final anchor. It does not conclude with definitive forensic proof. It does not unravel into exposed conspiracy. It remains suspended in an evidentiary gap created in the earliest hours after the fire. On December 24, 1945, a family celebrated Christmas. By sunrise, 5 children were gone. Whether they were lost to flame or to something orchestrated under cover of flame is a question that has endured for more than 80 years. The physical house is gone. The billboard is gone. Parents are gone, but the unanswered details remain, archived, debated, reconsidered, waiting in the quiet space where certainty should have been. As the decades continued to pass, the Sodder case became less about active investigation and more about the anatomy of uncertainty. Scholars of criminal justice and forensic history sometimes reference it not as proof of conspiracy, but as an illustration of how early procedural gaps can echo across generations. If the fire scene had been secured under modern standards, the outcome might have been different. Today, investigators would map the structure in 3 dimensions, document burn depth, collect layered debris samples, and screen systematically for human remains using fine mesh recovery tools. Dental records would be compared. Mitochondrial DNA could be extracted from even small fragments of bone. None of those measures were standard practice in 1945 rural West Virginia. Instead, debris was cleared relatively quickly. The coroner's conclusion was entered. Life in Fayetteville resumed. One of the enduring questions is whether the case's mystery stems from something extraordinary or simply from the absence of thorough documentation. When records are incomplete, the human mind fills the space. Take the latter. George insisted it was always kept against the house. After the fire, it was not there. Later, it was reportedly found discarded nearby. Was it moved by someone intending access? Was it shifted during the chaos by a neighbor attempting to help? Was memory distorted under stress? There is no contemporaneous photograph of its original position. No written log of who found it and precisely when. The same applies to the phone line. Accounts state it was cut. But detailed forensic photographs of the severed wire do not exist in public record. Was the line definitively severed before the fire began? Or could structural collapse have created the appearance of a clean break? The distinction is critical, yet permanently unresolved. The disabled trucks follow a similar pattern. Engines that worked the day before failed in a crisis. Mechanical inspection afterward did not reveal obvious sabotage, but neither did it produce a definitive explanation. Cold weather, fuel issues, panic attempts to start the engines repeatedly, any of these could have contributed. Without preserved parts or diagnostic reports, interpretation remains speculative. Even the speed of the fire's spread, often described as unusually rapid, may not be exceptional under the right conditions. A wooden home, holiday decorations, possibly open windows, and structural airflow can accelerate flame progression significantly. Eyewitness perception of time during emergency events is notoriously unreliable. Minutes can feel like seconds. And yet, the absence of remains continues to stand apart. Modern cremation requires sustained heat and mechanical processing to reduce bone to fine ash. In uncontrolled fires, bone fragments typically survive in some recognizable form. That is not speculation. It is consistent with forensic case studies, but survival does not guarantee recovery. Without systematic sifting and screening, fragments can be overlooked or discarded with debris. It is possible the remains were present and never properly identified. It is possible they were there but mistaken for construction material. It is possible they were never there at all. The 1968 photograph remains the only tangible artifact that disrupts the accidental fire narrative. Its existence keeps the survival theory alive. Facial resemblance can be compelling, especially to grieving parents. But resemblance without confirmation cannot establish identity. Some modern researchers have attempted digital age progression, comparing childhood photos of Louis Sodder with the adult in the mailed image. Results vary. Without genetic confirmation, similarity remains subjective. The coded message written on the back has generated decades of quiet analysis. Was it a location reference? A military identification? A prison number? Random characters. The lack of context makes interpretation nearly impossible. If the message held meaning, that meaning has not been unlocked. The case also exists within a broader pattern of mid-century American house fire investigations. Records from that era show multiple instances where early fire conclusions were accepted with minimal forensic reconstruction. Many were accurate, some were not. The difference often depended on available resources, training, and willingness to question initial assumptions. In the Sodder case, the speed of official closure may have unintentionally solidified doubt. When families feel investigation has been incomplete, suspicion can outlive evidence. There is also a sociological element. Small communities often prioritize stability. A tragic accident can be processed. A coordinated kidnapping conspiracy is destabilizing. It suggests ongoing threat. In 1945, just after World War II, a rural town may have been more inclined toward the simplest explanation available. But simplicity does not always equal truth. Over time, the mystery became self-sustaining. Each retelling emphasized certain elements: the threatening remark about fire, the cut phone line, the ladder, the disabled trucks, the sightings, the photograph. These details, repeated consistently, form a pattern in public memory stronger than the sparse official record. Yet when stripped back to confirmed documentation, the case remains remarkably thin. A fire, 5 missing children, no confirmed remains, no verified relocation, no proven conspiracy, just a series of irregularities and the persistence of parental belief. In modern analysis, investigators often apply probability assessment. What scenario requires fewer assumptions? That 5 children died in a rapidly spreading fire and early search efforts failed to recover remains? Or that multiple individuals coordinated an abduction under cover of arson, transported the children across state lines without trace, maintained secrecy for decades, and left only a single ambiguous photograph. The first scenario relies on investigative limitation. The second relies on sustained concealment. Both are possible. Neither is provable, and so the Sodder Children mystery remains suspended in that narrow space between plausibility and proof. The property where the house once stood is quiet now. There are no visible markers beyond memory. Traffic passes along the road where the billboard once displayed 5 young faces and a reward offer. History records the official conclusion, but history also records the absence that followed. In some cases, time exposes what fire tried to hide. In others, time simply layers silence over unanswered questions. For the Sodder family and for those who continue to examine the file, the central fact has never changed. On Christmas Eve, 1945, 5 children went upstairs to sleep. By morning, they were gone. They were gone. Whether they were claimed by flame or carried into the night remains a question that has never been conclusively resolved and may never be. When a case survives this long without resolution, it begins to exist in 2 parallel forms. One is the documented event, contained in newspaper clippings, coroner's notes, insurance files, and family statements. The other is the interpretive shadow, the space where unanswered details are arranged into meaning. The Sodder case occupies both spaces at once. If we return again to the earliest hours of December 25, 1945, and strip the narrative down to sequence alone, the framework remains stark. A late-night phone call, a fire discovered shortly after, parents and several children escape. 5 children do not. Attempts to reach them fail. The structure collapses. Firefighters arrive too late to intervene. By morning, the house is gone. In many tragedies, that sequence would be sufficient. But here the aftermath destabilizes the simplicity. The search of the debris was neither prolonged nor scientifically structured by modern standards. Ash and rubble were cleared within days. The coroner's jury ruled accidental cause. Death certificates were issued. From an administrative perspective, the case closed quickly. Yet George Sodder did something uncommon for a grieving father in 1945. He refused the conclusion. He did not merely express doubt. He actively challenged the physical plausibility of complete incineration. He sought outside opinions. He examined the scene repeatedly. He questioned the behavior of the fire department. He revisited the threats he had received prior to the blaze. Over time, his persistence transformed the event from a concluded tragedy into an open question. One of the most significant psychological components of this case is the absence of remains. In most fatal fire investigations, even when bodies are severely burned, some identifiable fragment remains, a portion of bone, dental structure, or personal artifact fused to skeletal material. In the Sodder case, no such fragment was conclusively documented as belonging to the 5 children. There was, at one point, mention of bone fragments found in the rubble. Later examination reportedly suggested those fragments were not consistent with the children's remains. Some accounts claim they may have originated from unrelated soil fill used on the property. Documentation surrounding that finding is incomplete, which further fuels uncertainty. Had a single verified fragment been identified, even one, the case might not have endured in public memory the way it has. Instead, absence became the central fact. The ladder, the trucks, and the phone line form the outer ring of suspicion around that absence. The ladder's relocation suggests access. The truck's failure suggests interference. The cut phone line suggests preparation. Individually, each can be explained through benign circumstances. Together, they suggest intent. The human mind is pattern-seeking. When multiple anomalies align around a central disappearance, the inference of coordination becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. Yet coordination requires actors. Who would orchestrate such an act? Retaliation tied to political disputes remains the most frequently cited motive. George's outspoken criticism of fascism reportedly angered certain members of the local Italian community. An insurance salesman allegedly warned him that his home would be destroyed and his children harmed. That same man later served on the coroner's jury. The optics are troubling. Fool. But troubling optics are not the same as evidence. No documentation proves that the salesman or anyone else acted on that threat. No witness places a known adversary at the scene during the fire. Suspicion rests on association and timing. Other theories move beyond political motive into criminal enterprise speculation. The idea that children were taken and relocated for reasons unrelated to ideology. However, such theories require infrastructure, secrecy, and sustained silence across decades. No paper trail, confession, or corroborated testimony has ever surfaced to support that scale of operation. If the children were abducted, they would have grown into adults carrying memories of their early lives. Not one verified individual has come forward claiming credible identity as one of the missing 5. In other long-term missing cases, eventual revelations sometimes emerge through genealogy, accidental discovery, or personal disclosure. None have occurred here. The 1968 photograph remains the outlier. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, with facial features resembling Louis Sodder, a cryptic inscription on the back. No return address, no follow-up communication. If the photograph were genuine, it suggests survival and perhaps a coded attempt at contact. But why only one photograph? Why no subsequent letters? Why no effort at reunion? The longer silence extended after that mailing, the more plausible the hoax explanation became. Still, the emotional impact of that image on the Sodder family cannot be understated. For parents who had never seen physical confirmation of death, the photograph functioned as possibility. It reopened hope that had never fully closed. The case also highlights the fragile relationship between official authority and personal conviction. Once the state declares a death, the burden of contradiction falls on those who disagree. The Sodders did not have the institutional leverage to compel federal reinvestigation. Their appeal relied on public awareness, hence the billboard. That billboard became a physical manifestation of unresolved grief. It stood for years, weathered by seasons, carrying 5 faces that the official record considered gone. Drivers passing through Fayetteville could not avoid confronting the unresolved nature of the case. It was both memorial and accusation. As investigative standards evolved nationally, the Sodder case became an example cited in discussions about the necessity of evidence preservation. It underscores how quickly scenes were once cleared and how permanently that haste can obscure truth. If modern forensic teams had processed the rubble slowly, layer by layer, perhaps fragments would have been found. Or perhaps the absence would have been definitively confirmed, strengthening the abduction theory. But that opportunity passed within days of the fire. Another dimension worth considering is community memory. In small towns, oral history often outlasts documentation. Over time, retellings of the Sodder story may have amplified certain details while minimizing others. Ulfa. The dramatic elements, threats, missing ladder, mysterious phone call, endure because they are narratively powerful. The mundane elements, paperwork, procedural limitations, administrative closure, fade because they lack emotional charge. This dynamic can unintentionally reshape perception. What remains stable, however, is the fundamental gap. 5 children were last confirmed inside a house. After the fire, they were never physically accounted for. No grave exists. No confirmed cremation remains exist. No verified relocation exists. The case, therefore, occupies a rare category. Officially closed, yet evidentially incomplete. In criminal investigation, closure usually requires convergence, physical evidence, witness testimony, motive alignment. The Sodder case lacks convergence. It contains fragments that point in multiple directions but never intersect, and so it endures. Not because it offers spectacle, not because it provides dramatic revelation, but because it resists finality. On that winter night in 1945, something happened beyond simple flame progression. Whether that is something that was investigative oversight or deliberate orchestration remains unproven. The house collapsed before dawn. The certainty collapsed with it. And more than 80 years later, the question remains suspended in the same quiet uncertainty that followed the smoke into the Appalachian sky. Did the fire take 5 children, or did the fire conceal something far more deliberate? There is no final page in the official file that resolves that question. Only the record of what burned, and the enduring silence where proof should have been. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Sodder case entered a different phase. Not active investigation, not fresh witness testimony, but reassessment. Historians, criminologists, and independent researchers began examining the case not only for what might have happened, but for how it was handled. The question slowly shifted from a what occurred that night to what was missed afterward. In modern fire science, investigators distinguish carefully between cause and origin. The point of origin is where the fire began. The cause explains why it began. In 1945, such distinctions were less rigorously applied in rural settings. Reports indicated the blaze may have started near the back of the house, possibly around electrical wiring, but no preserved diagrams or photographs clearly establish a single ignition point. If an accelerant or incendiary device had been used, residue testing today might reveal chemical traces embedded in soil or debris. In 1945, no such laboratory testing occurred. That absence does not imply arson, but it permanently eliminates the ability to confirm or deny it scientifically. Another overlooked factor is structural airflow. Wooden homes with open staircases can act like chimneys during a fire, drawing flames upward rapidly. If the fire began downstairs and ventilation allowed quick vertical spread, the upper floor could have been compromised within minutes. That scenario supports the accidental fire theory. However, if the fire began externally or at multiple points, it would suggest planning. Without preserved structural evidence, interpretation is limited to witness recollection. Witness recollection, especially during trauma, is unreliable in precise detail. Time compresses, sounds distort, spatial memory fragments. Jenny recalled hearing something strike the roof. That detail has been interpreted by some as evidence of an incendiary device thrown from outside. It has also been interpreted as debris falling or structural cracking as the fire spread. No physical artifact was definitively tied to that sound. The object later found in the yard, described as resembling a wartime grenade or a pineapple bomb, complicates the narrative further. But without chain of custody, documentation, or laboratory analysis, the object remains anecdotal. It exists in testimony, not in preserved evidence. Then there is the issue of timing. The fire department's delayed arrival is often framed as suspicious. In reality, rural firefighting in 1945 relied on volunteers summoned by telephone. The chief reportedly lacked the ability to drive the engine himself and waited for assistance. This delay, while tragic, aligns with the infrastructural limitations of the era. Yet in a case already burdened by irregularities, delay reinforces suspicion. The Sodder family's immediate belief that the children survived is psychologically significant. Most parents confronted with fatal fire evidence, including visible remains, accept loss through devastating clarity. The Sodders had no such clarity. Their belief was not formed years later. It began within days. George reportedly sifted through the rubble personally and claimed to find household objects intact that should have been destroyed if temperatures were high enough to cremate bodies fully. Critics argue that comparing metal objects and human remains oversimplifies combustion science. Different materials respond differently to heat. Still, the inconsistency troubled him deeply. When grief and anomaly coexist, conviction can solidify quickly. In the years following the fire, reports of sightings became a secondary narrative track. A woman in Charleston claimed to see the children in a car. A tourist stop operator in South Carolina described serving them breakfast. A motel owner in Florida reported seeing children matching their descriptions, accompanied by adults who discouraged conversation. Each report alone was thin. Together, they created a geographic pattern extending beyond West Virginia, yet none resulted in verified identification, photographs, or documentation. Interstate coordination in 1945 was slow and inconsistent. Leads that today would generate immediate alerts may have dissipated quietly then. Some researchers argue that if the children had been taken intentionally, they may have been relocated within tight-knit immigrant communities where questions were minimized and assimilation was facilitated. However, such relocation would require long-term secrecy across multiple adults. Sustained silence over decades is statistically rare without at least one credible confession or leak. No such confession has surfaced. The 1968 photograph continues to anchor speculation. The young man's facial features, particularly the eyes, appear similar to Louis Sodder's childhood photographs. Age progression comparisons conducted informally by later researchers yield mixed interpretations. Some see resemblance, others see coincidence. The inscription on the back remains opaque. A Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illeal boys, Aninity 1132 or 35. The phrasing is unusual. The numbers unexplained. If it was a coded attempt at contact, the code has never been broken. If it was a hoax, it was carefully constructed to provoke recognition. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the photograph is the absence of follow-up. If the sender intended to reconnect, why stop at one mailing? If they feared retaliation, why risk sending even one? The silence that followed deepened the ambiguity. As the original generation passed away, the case transitioned into archival history. The Sodder children's surviving siblings carried fragments of memory, but time inevitably eroded direct knowledge. The billboard that once displayed their faces was eventually removed. Weather and age reduced it to disrepair. But removal of the billboard did not remove the question. In academic circles, the case is sometimes cited in discussions of confirmation bias. Once individuals commit to a belief, accidental death or deliberate abduction, subsequent details are interpreted through that lens. For those convinced the children perished, anomalies become coincidences amplified by grief. For those convinced they survived, coincidences become coordinated evidence. Without new data, the divide remains permanent. It is also important to recognize that the absence of proof cuts both ways. There is no conclusive evidence of abduction. There is also no conclusive forensic confirmation of death. The official ruling resolved the case administratively, but not evidentially to modern standards. This dual absence is why the Sodder mystery persists when countless other house fires from the same era have faded from memory. Most had bodies recovered, most lacked layered irregularities, most did not include anonymous photographs decades later. The Sodder case contains just enough disruption to resist closure. In contemporary times, some have proposed advanced DNA genealogical analysis if any preserved material could be located. However, no verified biological samples exist in custody. The soil at the original site has been disturbed repeatedly. Any potential remains, if present, would likely be fragmented and degraded beyond reliable extraction. Therefore, the case rests where it has for decades, in narrative equilibrium. An accidental fire scenario explains the lack of survivors upstairs but struggles with the total absence of identifiable remains. An abduction scenario explains the absence of remains and some anomalies but requires sustained, undocumented secrecy. Neither scenario can be proven. As historians look back, the Sodder Children mystery becomes less about choosing between those scenarios and more about understanding the cost of uncertainty. It demonstrates how investigative limitations of one era can project unresolved doubt into the next. It illustrates how grief, suspicion, and incomplete documentation intertwine. On Christmas Eve 1945, a family went to sleep in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Before dawn, 5 children were missing. The flames ended within hours. The ambiguity has endured for generations. And somewhere between ash and absence, the truth, whatever it was, remains unverified, suspended in the quiet space where definitive evidence never took hold. In the end, the Sodder Children mystery does not close with revelation. It closes the way it began, in uncertainty. There was no courtroom confession, no verified remains discovered decades later, no aging adult stepping forward with irrefutable proof of identity, no sealed document uncovered in an archive that rewrote the official conclusion. There was only a fire and 5 children who were never conclusively accounted for. Over time, the case settled into a permanent question mark. Administratively, it was resolved. Death certificates were issued. Records were filed. The state considered the matter complete. But resolution on paper is not the same as resolution in truth. George Sodder died believing his children survived. Jenny carried that belief quietly for the rest of her life. The billboard that once stood along Route 16, displaying the faces of Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, eventually came down. Weather wore it away. Traffic passed. New generations grew up with only fragments of the story, yet the core fact never changed. No confirmed remains were ever identified. That absence is the center of the mystery. Everything else, the missing ladder, the cut phone line, the disabled trucks, the strange phone call, the reported sightings, the photograph mailed decades later, forms a ring around that single, unresolved void. It is possible the children died in the fire and early investigative limitations erased the physical proof. It is possible the fire concealed something deliberate and the truth was carried away before dawn. Both explanations remain plausible. Neither can be proven. And that is why the Sodder case endures. Not because it offers spectacle, not because it promises dramatic conspiracy, but because it sits in that rare and unsettling space between documented tragedy and unanswered disappearance. On Christmas Eve 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a house burned to the ground. By morning, 5 children were gone. The flames faded, the smoke cleared, the paperwork was signed, but the question never did. What truly happened in those early hours, accident or orchestration, may never be known. And sometimes, in the quiet archive of unresolved history, that uncertainty is the only thing that survives.